were there, you checked in, you don't have to do it. The brave of you who came in on a Friday, you are there in person, so you benefit directly. This is for people who were not able to attend in person. All right, any questions in your mind from the last class? Anything in your minds? Nothing? Your midterm is on Tuesday. Your midterm is on Tuesday. I guarantee you there's one way you can fail. An automatic way you can fail. You know what that is?
Don't show up.
Don't show up. Or show up late. So this is going to be a strict rule. If you're not there on time, you don't take the exam. It may sound unfair, but think of your classmates. It's extremely distracting when you walk in late and your people and your classmates are trying to take an exam. So this is 2 o'clock. There's no reason that you should not be here on time. You know, if it's 9 a.m. class every semester, someone says, oh, the bus broke down and the HOV line, I don't care. Get here on time for the midterm. Take it. If you fail, there's a consequence, right? The consequence is I lower your grade by a third on participation. I don't have the power as a professor to make your 1L grade count other than the final exam, but I do have power over your participation score. So I haven't done it in a few semesters. A couple semesters ago, a student didn't show up. He said he had a car accident. I'm not sure if you're telling the truth, whatever. He got a bump down. So don't make me do it. Okay? If you show up and you give a modicum of effort, you're going to pass. But just don't blow it off. Understood? I don't want to fail anyone. This is for your benefit. And after the midterm is administered, I'm going to send out a link for you to sign up for a time to meet with me. Between now and the end of the semester, there'll be about 100 slots. All my students, both sections, will have to sign up for slots. All of you. About 100-something students a semester, all that many slots. This is for your advantage, not for mine, it's a lot of time. But more often than not, at this mid-juncture, I can correct course. Right? If I see something you're doing wrong, I can give you some advice and maybe put you back on the right track. If you blow it off and don't take it seriously, you know, that's on you. I can't help you beyond that. But I'm here. We want to help you. It's this. The school's trying to do this thing called formative assessment. Have you heard of this? You know what this means? It's usually in law school you get like one exam at the end, right? At the end of the semester, and that's your only grade, and you have no idea why you got what you got. So what we're trying to do as a school is to give you feedback early. Right, midway point of the semester, so that if you're doing something wrong, you can fix it. Anyway, so that's the reason why we give the midterm. If I had my druthers, which I don't, I would make the midterm worth maybe 10% of your final exam. I can't do that, so this is the best I can do under the circumstances. All right. So any exams about the, or any questions about the exam coming up?
You did say you were going to, even though it's just passed.
Oh, I'm grading it. Yeah, no, I'll give you a grade. You're going to get a grade A, B, C, whatever it is. But it won't count for anything beyond your own edification. Yeah, Amber.
I saw on your video you talked about it being exam soft, right? So
you'll get that tomorrow.
Okay.
The registrar promised me you would get it either today or tomorrow. If you don't get it tomorrow, ask me and I'll go bug them, okay? But you should get an exam number. And the way it works, just to explain this, the exam number you get for the midterm will not be your final exam number. There are different numbers. I don't want to know your final exam number. It's not in my interest. But use the number they give you. Don't use your number from last semester. If you do that, I can't grade your paper. And I mean this sincerely, don't make up a number. Every semester, I swear, at least 1 or 2 people don't have their number handy, so they make up a number. So one semester, a guy used his birthday, so they're actually able to track that down with some ease, right? Because the digits he gave were more than the number of the exam. It was like an 8-digit number. It's supposed to be a 6-digit number. So don't make up a number. Give me your actual. Yes, Brittany.
So we have to do it on exam soft.
You don't have to. I strongly encourage you to type it. But if you want to write it by hand, there'll be blue books available. It's to your advantage to type, but you know people have preferences, so do as you wish.
Did you say 1,000 words?
Yeah. And the software has a word limit. Right? The software has a word limit. It's in ExamSoft, under Tools, Statistics, do word count. If you don't know how to do it, go to the registrar, they'll explain it. Now, do not give me 1,000 characters. Everyone know the difference between a word and a character. I make this announcement because people do this, not every year, but every other year. 1,000 characters is like 5 text messages, right? It's a couple sentences. Do not give me 1,000 characters. That might get you an F. The person who did that got a gentleman's D because it was in the ballpark, but don't do that. Give me 1,000 words, not 1,000 characters. And at this point, all of my old exams are online. You should have taken one. If you haven't yet, this weekend, that's your homework, right? Go and take an old exam, quiet, 90 minutes, and grade yourself. Compare it to the A+. The only way to prepare for this exam is by taking my old exams. At this point, I think I have like maybe 10 or 11 old questions up there by now. More than enough for you to work on. I have old midterms up there. Take those as well. Yeah, Kevin?
So if we bring any kind of material.
Whatever you want, won't help you.
Well,
Bring whatever you want. I don't care.
Is there a certain kind of,
I don't care.
restrictions?
No. Books, print it, it won't help you.
We can bring a binder that.
If you're looking at a binder that big, you're doing something wrong. You're not gonna have time to look at that, right? That's the reason why. It's not going to help you. Now, you can't bring an iPad, right? People ask that. No electronic sources. I don't want you bring your iPad, your laptop, it's gonna be locked down. You can print out whatever you want. You can bring, you know, a 4-volume set in the Constitution. It won't help you at all. And I mean that sincerely. If you find yourself during the exam flipping through pages, you didn't study well, right? Maybe your notes will help you the name of a case, you forget the name. Maybe you forget the year of a case, right? Or maybe you can't remember who wrote an opinion, what judge wrote it. Okay, notes will help you there. But I mean, an outline this big is probably will do you more good than something this big. So you won't have the temptation of flipping through all those pages. I mean, bring whatever you want. I really couldn't care less. I mean, there was actually I think it was a high school teacher who told her students, you can bring a 3x5 index card for your exam. Do you know what one student did? 3 feet by 5 feet. You saw this?
Yeah.
3 feet, you know, it's basically a poster board, right? And you know, you can see this picture of the student with the massive poster board with like, you know, little print. I had that in college, even like 1 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, you know, so I wrote really small. Actually, I was, you know, I don't care. Bring whatever you want, won't help you. Make sense, Kevin? Good. What else? Take it seriously. I mean that. I can share the numbers on this. Without exception, the grade you get on your midterm will almost certainly be your final grade. It happens every semester. I can show you the numbers if you don't believe me. Some people go up, some people go down. But how you do here is probably where you're going to wind up. So show me good and as best as you can be, even though we're only, you know, halfway through the semester. This is class 14, I think, so so 13, we're right at the halfway point. Anything else? Yes.
So up to today's.
Yep, today's
lesson
fair
will be
game.
on-
Today's fair game. Today's fair game. Anything else? Going once? Twice? All right. Now I'll turn off the attendance. Okay. So, I want to start with a question. See how this one goes. And I framed this question at a very, in a very specific way. I spent some time tweaking it. So I think I asked it the way I want to, though I never know until I see the results. So this is your question, right? This is your poll. The judgment in Dred Scott was correct in 1857. What's your question? You have 40 seconds. Think about it. The judgment in Dred Scott was correct in 1857. True, false? Another 10 to 15 seconds. That's your question. All right, we'll stop it there. Okay, where did I leave off last time? Who's next? Oh, didn't you step out the last minute last time? You're up. All right, it's okay. I'm gonna come back here. So before we get to whether you put true, false, Rosario, what does it mean for a judgment to be correct? I mean, what does that even mean? I framed the question very delicately. What does it mean for a judgment to be correct? What's a judgment? It's right there. So what was the judgment in Dred Scott? What was the actual bottom line judgment? Putting aside everything else, all the other crazy stuff, right? What was the actual judgment in the bottom line of the case? Well, that was like the holding, right? What was the actual judgment? What was the effect of the decision in terms of Scott and Sandford? What was the bottom line after you got through all those 40 pages of reading? Right? I know. What was the bottom line? Well, that's true. That's a holding, right? What was the actual judgment? The effect of the Dred Scott decision?
Missouri compromise? Constitution?
Between Scott and Sandford, what was the effect of the judgment on their lawsuit? The bottom line.
It's still a slave.
And as a result, what happened to his lawsuit?
No, it's dismissed. If
For?
he doesn't have jurisdiction.
Thank you. Exactly. Repeat it one more time.
It was dismissed because he didn't have jurisdiction.
Okay, right. So the bottom line, right, of Dred Scott, and it's crazy to think about it. It's a jurisdictional case, right? It's a diversity jurisdiction case, and we'll do this at some length. So the judgment of the Supreme Court after you get through all those crazy things, right, is dismissed for want of jurisdiction because of lack of diversity. Because one of the parties is not a citizen of Missouri or any state for that matter. So the question then I posed then, right? Rachel, the question I posed then is, was the judgment in Dred Scott correct? And I didn't say correct any time, I said correct in 1867.
Well, they're dismissing it for lack of jurisdiction, so how can judgment be correct if they don't have jurisdiction of the person? So it's...
Well, but was it correct that the court lacked jurisdiction?
It was incorrect that the court lacked
Was it
jurisdiction.
in 1857? Was it in 1857? Was that judgment incorrect at the time it was decided?
The judgment was incorrect, and
Uh-huh.
they did have jurisdiction over Dred Scott.
How do you know that?
Well,
Why do you say that?
because the judgment in Dred Scott was wrong.
Why was it
in
wrong?
conflict. It was in conflict with the due process clause and other parts.
Says who?
McLean.
Oh, he was in dissent, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was.
Jessica. Let's give Professor Finnegan. Jessica.
Would it have been correct? Because the majority said that he wasn't a citizen.
What does it mean for a judgment in the Supreme Court to be correct? Isn't it always whatever the majority says is right? Isn't that the end of the story? Is there anything else? Yeah, she said McLean was in dissent. There were only two of them. He actually resigned from the bench. He was so angry at this decision. He actually stepped down the following year. That's what I mean. How can the majority of the decision court be wrong? That was the question. Was the judgment correct? Okay.
Said that they overruled the Missouri Supreme Court standings they had.
Well, that's true. Isn't the Supreme Court superior over state Supreme Courts? Can't U.S. Supreme Court overturn the state Supreme Court if they want?
Not that the state issue, solely state issue.
But there's also a federal question on this, wasn't it? That how citizenship is defined. Doesn't the states even decide who's a citizen?
Yes, they can.
What the Supreme Court said about that, what Tani said.
That's why I said it was wrong. It said the Constitution in the beginning said states and
Andre, how can the Supreme Court decision be wrong?
Well, I didn't think it was wrong.
Okay. So you think it was correct at the time?
I thought it was correct at the time.
Why do you say that?
Because, well,
like the way I see it is in 1857, it's like temporal, like
Temporal, oh, what do you mean by temporal? Give me a synonym for that.
of the time.
Good, thank you.
At the time, it was the correct interpretation because, I mean, I don't know. That's
Do you think at the time it was correct, but is it still correct today?
No, it's not correct.
Okay, why is this no longer correct today?
It was
2000.
overturned by the 13th or 14th.
How can an amendment overturn its case? So how did it even work?
Because I think it said in here that if you think it's unjust, then you can amend the law.
All right, Jonathan, what's your take? Was this decision, was the judgment correct in 1857?
It's true because mirrors every other, there's like the reasoning and.
So, and there were seven, I think it was 7-2, right? 7 justices, the majority. Does the majority of the Supreme Court make it a correct judgment? In other words, is the law merely whatever 5 lawyers in Washington say it is?
Five is all you need and that's all you argue for.
What if you have 10? How about that? Actually, there was a brief period in the Civil War that had 10 justices. It was about a year or so. By the way, where does it say in the Constitution you only need a majority to strike down an act? In fact, some state Supreme Courts have rules that they need a supermajority to strike down laws. You need 7 out of 9, for example. Phyllis, what's your take? You're rethinking. Oh, I love when people rethink. But what was your initial answer?
Just like initial answer, I put false.
You put false.
I knew that I was wrong, but I just thought it was bad judgment.
You said bad. Okay, but did I say that whether it's good, bad, right, wrong, ethical, unethical? What was the word I used? Correct. All right, let's see the results. I don't know. I'm curious. I always love putting the results up on it because I don't know the answers. Wow, that's pretty close. That might be the closest we've had all semester, I think, or close to it. Look at this. 53% said it was wrong. 47 said it was correct. So, I mean, this is, split down the middle. If one of you change your vote to be 17-17, right, it'd be right down the middle. It's a harder question than I thought it was, isn't it? So I think the reason why you're also struggling is that, you're all bright law students, right? You're here, you're in your second semester, you've been thinking about this for a while. And then you look at the decision, right, and you read it, and you're like, oh my God, this is such an awful decision, right? You read like, how can any person write this, like in a judicial decision? And then you put your analytical hats like, well, wait a minute though. Maybe he was right at the time that that's what U.S. law was like, and it took an amendment to nullify that decision. Right? Right. This case, the Dred Scott decision, was something that literally ripped the country apart. It didn't cause a civil war. People say that. That's not what caused the civil war. The country was headed for a war one way or the other. Whether it happened with Lincoln or later, it was going to happen. The Union wasn't in good shape. But it accelerated it. It brought it on quicker. And Chief Justice Tani, who we've studied a bit, he had his decision in Ex parte Merriman. Remember the case where the guy was knocking on the door at Fort McHenry, right? His intent with this decision, which you read a lot of pages on, was to eliminate the need for a war. He thought that by writing this decision, he would settle the issue of slavery for good. He would settle the issue so that way people would just accept the judgment of the court. So this returns to a theme I developed is, why do people follow court decisions? When Tani ordered the general to release Merriman, the general said, sorry, not going to do it. Not going to do it. When Tani here declares that Dred Scott, and indeed all people of African descent, cannot be citizens by virtue of their birthright. By virtue of their birthright. Is that even a decision that people were bound to follow? They had not just 5 votes, they had 7 votes in the Supreme Court. Now, the fact of the matter is most presidents in the early republic were Southerners. Most of the justices appointed were slave sympathizers. That was a factor of the Electoral College because Free Goods Compromise, bigger population, more of electoral votes in the South, right? They didn't vote, but they had representation for them. So most of the early presidents, with the exception of John Adams, John Quincy, and maybe one or two others I'm drawing a blank on, were all Southerners and they're all slave supporters. That's why there's a lot of Virginians in the White House earlier on. So as a result, the people they picked to the court were also sympathizers of slavery. But you have 5 judges, and I think it was Jonathan, someone said it. You have a majority of the court. That's a majority of the court. That's it. So, you know, today we think, of course, if 5 judges say something, we just simply follow it. But a decision like this challenges that assumption, doesn't it? Right? It makes you think, like, oh, wait a minute. What if these 5 judges are off the rails and they're saying these things, which, by the way, had I changed this question to the opinion in Dred Scott was correct, I think it becomes a much closer question, right? I think Justice Curtis and McLean bring up good points in dissent, that maybe Tani got his history wrong. I think he probably did. But the judgment, though, if a court finds you lack jurisdiction, that's usually the end of the road for you, right? So we're going to spend the entire class in this case. Usually I do Dred Scott in other cases, but this year I decided to give an entire class to it because it's such a deep case that warrants very careful study. By the way, I'm probably going to ask this question again at the end of the class. I did that last week. I'm going to ask this question again, poll you again later, and see if the numbers change. We'll see. I don't know. Maybe they won't. Maybe they will. I don't know. But let's walk through. The monitor's doing this weird thing where it gets cut off. Let me make it a little bit smaller. I don't know why it's doing this. Yeah, it's some weird formatting issue. All right, there you go. You see it? Good, thank you. Right, so this is Dred Scott. There's a picture of Harriet, his wife, in your book, I think. Yeah, we actually added some new pictures about the Dred Scott case in your book. They'll be there soon. By the way, if any of you ever visit the Minneapolis airport, Fort Snelling, where Scott lived with his wife, is literally across the street from the airport. I was so angry at myself. I went to give a talk in Minneapolis last year, and I was getting it right back, and my host said, "Oh, by the way, there's Fort Snelling." I was like, "What?" And I had an hour left. I didn't have enough time to go. I was so angry. But I hope to go back at some point in the future. But they have actually an exhibit there. It looks very nice, but hope to visit at some point. This is actually the cover sheet of the decision from the Supreme Court to Dred Scott v. Sandford. By the way, the actual name of the book is Sandford with a D. That was an error. The clerk of the court, it was Sandford, there's no D, but the clerk of the court put a D in there, so I will use the official name and say Dred Scott v. Sandford. Okay? Let's talk about geography for a minute. And geography here is actually very, very significant in this case. So, as some of you may know, I talked about this, one of the most significant events in constitutional history was the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, President Jefferson authorized the acquisition of an entire swath of land. And it's called Louisiana Purchase, but it's not just Louisiana. It was like this entire swath of land over here from the French. At the time, the French were in somewhat difficult times. They needed the money. They didn't really care to have territories in the New World, so they sold it to Jefferson. Now, there was a very serious constitutional question. Did the president have the power to purchase land on his own? The answer, from my perspective, is he does not. Jefferson actually agreed, and what Jefferson basically said was, I don't have the power to do this, but this is really important. So I'm going to do it anyway, because I'm the president. So the Nixon, right, if I do it, that makes it constitutional. And this is often cited as an instance where the executive, the chief executive, basically admitted that he'd violate the Constitution because it was such an important moment, right? Jefferson basically said, I don't have time to go to Congress and have them debate this for a few months, right? The deal was on the table, and we got to take the deal. All right. So when Jefferson acquired the Louisiana Territory for about $15 million, I mean, that's not talking about a lot of money there. It basically doubled the size of the United States. So it doubled the territory of the United States. But this created a question. Would this new territory be free, that is, slavery was prohibited, or would it be slave, or would it be a little bit of both? Okay? So as a threshold matter, Jefferson did not make it free territory. which more or less left it to the territories themselves how to govern. And as this green line shows, over the natural course of time, the southern, more agrarian territories authorized slavery, and the more northern, industrial is the wrong word, but equivalent of industrial communities did not permit slavery. And the reason why the divide between slave states and free states was so important had to do with the electoral map, right? The more slaves a state had, the more representation they had in the House. And the more representation they had in the House, the more votes they had in the Electoral College, right? And again, with the Three-Fifths Compromise, the slaves couldn't vote, but they counted for representation. So as a result, the southern states, even though they had fewer white people, had a lot of African American slaves, and their population swelled. As a result, they had a bigger share in Congress, they had a bigger share in the Electoral College. That's why almost all the early presidents, except for the Adamses, were Southerners, from Virginia, etc. They were elected by the South. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was elected president without a single Southern electoral vote, not one. He wasn't even on the ballot in most Southern states. That's how big the disparity was. So in 1820, Congress adopted what's called the Missouri Compromise. And what the Missouri Compromise basically said was any territory north of this green line, which is the 36th parallel, would be free. And any new state admitted south of the parallel would be a slave state. Okay? The reason why it was called the Missouri Compromise was it basically admitted Missouri to the Union as a slave state and admitted little old Maine up there as a free state. It was this compromise that Chief Justice Tani went out to declare unconstitutional in the Dred Scott decision. Okay? Everyone with me? So I'm going to get to the background. So the reason why this case was so significant had nothing to do with whether diversity jurisdiction was proper. Right? That was just like that was just like a way to get into court. But the case itself was about really the future of the Republic. So there are a few provisions of the Constitution that I want to walk you through now. I mentioned them at various places throughout the semester. I want to bring them together for you now. The first is Article 4, Section 3. This is what's called the Property Clause. The Property Clause. You never knew there was a Property Clause, did you? There is. And it says, the Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or the property belonging to the United States. This was the provision of the Constitution that was seen as giving Congress the power to legislate in the territories, right? Giving Congress the power to legislate over the territories. Specifically, whether they can make a territory free or slave. Right? This was the provision. Right? Justice Tani would give a very strange reading of this clause, one we'll talk about later, one I think that absolutely has to be wrong. Okay, the next one is one we've discussed as well. This is called the Migration Clause, Article 1, Section 9. And this basically said that the migration of such persons as any of the states shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited before 1808. This was the slave clause. I'm sorry, the slave trade clause. This said the slave trade, the African, European, that little triangle there, right? That could not be prohibited until 1808. Now, we discussed this. The clause doesn't use the word slaves. In fact, the framers were very much careful about not using the word slavery in the Constitution. They used this euphemism, such persons, right? We know what you're talking about. There's not a mystery. But they went around this. Tani, again, cites this provision for the proposition that slaves cannot be citizens because they're specifically referenced in this manner. Okay, the next clause. Article 4, Section 2. There's actually a couple pieces here. So the first provision says, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Now, we've discussed this. The phrase privileges and immunities refers to certain rights, certain liberties. Now, notice it says citizens of each state. It doesn't say citizens of the United States, it says citizens of each state. One would think that if you were a free African American in New York or Massachusetts, which were free states, you would benefit from this clause. But what does Tani hold? No. That this benefit, these privileges, cannot reach certain people. Why is that so important? Because if a runaway slave made it to Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, he could then become a citizen under state law and claim those benefits. Say, look, I got these benefits, you can't send me back down south, Maryland or Virginia. So Tani had to also deal with this clause, right? What you have to understand is Tani was he was a smart guy, right? He was very smart. He was systematically going clause by clause in the Constitution, saying you can't get from this, you can't get this, you can't get this, right? Right down the line. The next one, right? Article 4, Section 2. Right, this is the Fugitive Slave Clause. We did this when we studied Prigg, Pennsylvania. And it says a person charged with any felony who shall flee from justice shall be delivered. And you have the related clause, the next one, right? No person held to service or labor, right? This is specifically saying if you're a slave and you escape, you get sent back home. But wait a minute, what if you're a citizen? One second. What if you become a citizen of Pennsylvania? Tani said, no. You can't be, because even if you are a citizen, you can still be returned under the Fugitive Slave Clause.
Blind spot, all it would be if you're property or you build a person.
And that's Tani's point. It says person held to service or labor, right? Not just a person, period. That there's a specific clause, right? There's one about fugitives in general, a person charged with felony, and there's a specific provision, a person held to service or labor, as if they're separate categories of people. So Tani said, look, we have these provisions. He's building up every aspect of the Constitution. Okay? All right. So then the questions are, right, were African American men and women citizens of states? If they were, they can invoke diversity jurisdiction and go to federal court. If not, they were stuck in state court, and good luck there. Could Congress actually legislate to make a territory free under the Territorial Clause? Or did it violate the Fifth Amendment due process clause to deprive slave owners of their property? And did the Constitution actually say that people of African descent could never be citizens of any state, let alone the United States? This is the frame of Tani's opinion. All right? So most of what he says, or all, I don't even know, but virtually everything he says is probably wrong. And he was trying to achieve the most pro-slavery outcome conceivable. Right? He wasn't just saying, imagine you wanted to write this opinion and the judgment was correct. You write a one-sentence opinion saying, he's not a citizen, dismissed for lack of diversity. Donezo, right? Done. But that's not here. In fact, the decision was so long that the reporter of the court actually edited it, right? After Tani submitted it, the reporter of the court actually cut stuff back saying, no, we can't publish this, it's too much. He so infuriated Justice McLean, the guy resigned saying, I can't deal with this anymore. So this was even among his colleagues, he wrote that this is not a good opinion. And it neglects a very important aspect of judging, right? So you all read the Obamacare case. Generally, judges try to avoid making constitutional rulings, right? They try to avoid reaching really tough questions. That they can decide a question on narrow grounds, they will. Tani did the absolute opposite, right? He not only went beyond the issues, he struck down a 40-year-old compromise from Congress about slave states because Dred Scott brought this lawsuit. All he had to say was there's no jurisdiction, go away, right? Dismissed. But he deliberately stepped beyond the facts of this case and tried to resolve this massive question about new state admission to the Union, right? He looked at the map the same way you're looking at it. He said, look, you have all this territory out here. He knew that over the next decade, new states would be added, and he wanted to settle this for himself. Yeah, Andre?
When I was reading the opinion, it seemed like he had a lot of this stuff in his pocket, and he was just waiting for it to be brought up in a case. So
here, actually, glad you mentioned it up. Tani didn't make this stuff up, by the way. there was a very long line of literature and writing by Southerners explaining why the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. In fact, there was a House committee report, I can't remember the year, 1830s, give or take, which basically made the same argument, that the Fifth Amendment's due process clause prevents the federal government from depriving people of their slaves. So people often give Tani a lot of credit. He doesn't deserve it. He didn't make this stuff up. He was reaching from a body of literature and a body of scholarship saying that the Fifth Amendment denies the government this power. But it's one thing for a member of Congress to write it, someone to write it in a pamphlet or give it in a speech. But when the Chief Justice makes the statement, it makes a difference, or does it? Or does it? And as we're reading this, I want you guys to keep in mind, you're Abraham Lincoln, right? You're this young lawyer from Illinois, and you read this decision. What do you do? It's like, all right, the Supreme Court spoke, let's move on. Guess that settles that. Well, what do you do? Let's actually go to the case, right? Who wants to give me the, where am I up to? Yeah, oh, Zach, there you go. Yeah. Give us the facts, or at least start off. The facts here are long and complicated, but just at least start us off, please.
I guess the basic facts was Dred Scott was a slave. So he traveled with his owner from Illinois.
No, he went to Illinois. Where did he start off from?
Illinois, yeah, with his owner. So
Where did he start off from?
Is it Missouri?
Yes.
Yeah, from Missouri, which is a slave state.
Good.
Went to Illinois with his owner, which was a free state.
Good.
So there he was married and he kind of started his own family. And
Yeah.
so he claimed.
But by the way, in order to get married, I want you to think about this for a moment. His wife was also a slave. That was a transaction, right? The owner of Harriet had to relinquish. So it's gross, but you basically need to have the consent of both owners for that transaction to happen because you're transferring property, right? That's actually what a marriage meant. They couldn't say, oh, wow, I like her, she's pretty, I want to fall in love with her. It was actually it was part of a business transaction. Okay, but go on. So he married Harriet, then what happened?
So then he went back with his owner.
Good.
He went back and then the owner died. So
Well, stuff happened before he died. Give me what happened before he died. Let's see, he dies much later in the narrative.
Before he died.
What about the Scott family? How'd they do as a family? What happened to the family?
I mean, he had a kid.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, where were the kids? Where were the kids born?
Wasn't it Illinois?
Yeah. And what was the other one?
Illinois. Wisconsin.
Well, Missouri. Okay, so there were two kids born, right? One was born, and this is, I can't imagine this, on a steamboat in the Mississippi north of the state line. So the daughter was actually born, Eliza, was actually born in federal water in a Union territory, and in a free territory, okay? The other child, Lizzie, was born back in Missouri, okay? All right, okay, so Zach, you're good, thank you very much. So here we have is, you had a slave, Dred Scott. His boss was Dr. Emerson, who was a doctor in the U.S. military. He took him to the Free Territory, which is present-day Minnesota, which I guess I told you, right by the MSP airport. It's like across the street. I'm so mad to go there. I'm really mad. I'll have to go back to Minnesota just for this. So he was traveling to Minnesota. He then traveled to Illinois, which is a free state. He had a child born on the navigable waters of the United States in north of in the Mississippi River, north of the Missouri line. And then his other child was born back in Missouri. Emerson died, and the facts here are very convoluted. But for some time, Emerson was not free, but was allowed to go and do his own thing. But then eventually, the widow of Emerson sold his ownership to a relative in New York. That's who Sandford was. So originally, before this transaction happened, Scott sued Emerson's widow in Missouri State Court. This is important. He sued the widow in Missouri State Court. The trial court in Missouri ruled in favor of Dred Scott. Okay, why? Because at the time, the precedent was, if you went to a free territory, you were now going to be freed. But the Missouri Supreme Court overruled its own precedent. and said that Illinois law was not sufficient to confer freedom upon him. Right? Because under the pre-existing law in Missouri, Scott would have been free. But the court overturned its own decision. Scott did not appeal that judgment to the U.S. Supreme Court. Why did he not do this? I think someone said it. Anyone know the reason why he didn't appeal to the Supreme Court? You want to take a guess? Why didn't he appeal that to the Supreme Court? You want to take a guess? No one. Someone said it before, actually. Anthony, what was the basis of the Missouri State Supreme Court's ruling, that the original one? On what basis did they say that he couldn't be emancipated? Anyone guess? What was the basis? I had said a minute ago. I already told you the answer. What? Under whose law? And can the Supreme Court reverse that? Amber?
No.
Why not?
Because it's Missouri state
And
law.
there's no what question? What question is lacking?
That was
Federal.
for federal, sorry.
No, you're right, I know what you meant. There's no federal question. Exactly. So the reason why Scott didn't appeal that judgment to the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, I didn't talk to his lawyer, is it was an adequate and independent state ground. There was no actual federal question in the case. So instead, Scott, and by this point Scott had fans, right? He had advocates. People in the abolitionist community were trying to help the guy out. Because he had a very good case. He went not only to a free territory, he went to a free state and had a child born there. Right? There was some good facts to help a decision. So after Scott was transferred, or his ownership was transferred to Emerson's brother, Sandford, they commenced a new suit in federal court. And now they invoke diversity citizenship. You've all studied diversity citizenship, right? If you have a citizen of New York suing a citizen of Missouri, you go to federal court. The amount of controversy I don't even think was in effect back then, right? But you have this diversity citizenship. Right? So the narrow question, right? The narrow question, this is the judgment I asked about at the outset of class, was Dred Scott a citizen for purposes of diversity jurisdiction, right? That was a narrow question. The lower court dismissed Scott's suit, saying that he lacked jurisdiction. Okay. Goes to Supreme Court. All right, case. Let's go. How does Tani, and by the way, it's pronounced Tani, not Tani, so it's like T-A-W-N-E-Y. So, case, tell me, how does Tani go about considering whether Scott is a citizen of Missouri? Because that's what's required. It's not a citizen of the United States for diversity, it's a citizen of the state. How does he go about this case? It's a long answer, so let's start us off here.
Well, he really started with determining who could be a citizen.
Very good. And so what in his mind determines who can be a citizen?
In his mind, it would be the Constitution.
Does the Constitution define citizenship? You've read it, we've read it, that's right. Does it say who's a citizen? So where's Tony getting this from?
History.
History, okay, good. What history is he citing?
Well, he started with the comparing slaves to the Indian race.
Oh. Okay, what does he say about them?
That they were always looked at as different than slaves because they were free and independent people. Neither the English or colonial governments claimed or exercised dominion over them. They were treated as foreign governments. Treaties had been negotiated with them, alliances sought with them in war, and they're, once again, he repeats, they were treated as foreigners, not living.
Very good. So Tawny's analysis, right, he's citing history. And he's saying as a matter of history, people of African descent are similar to the Indians, right, in that they're a separate nation, basically. They're from a different body politic. Right? But wait a minute, Carlo, was it the case that a number of northern states made African American citizens? I mean, you had Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. I mean, there were a bunch of them. Didn't those states allow these people into the body politic as you know, full citizens? They could vote, they could hold property, do whatever they wish. What does Tani say in response to that?
Well, I believe he started talking about them, about that class of people always being property, and that whatever the states choose to do, they cannot unilaterally decide to remove that property from people.
Very good. So you have to understand why he wrote the decision the way he did, right? Again, he was a smart guy. He knew what he was doing. If he had simply just said that under the Constitution, people of African descent are not citizens, and that was the end of the decision, what if another case came up from Massachusetts or from New York, Pennsylvania, and you had a person of African descent saying, but my state gave me citizenship. They gave him a little piece of paper saying, you are emancipated, you are a citizen. Tani didn't want this decision to be reversed. So he had to go out of his way, all the way, to say, even if a state confers citizenship on a person of African descent, they can never be a citizen because they're inferior as a person, right? I think that, I don't know, I think that's the reason why he uses such egregious language, right? The subordinate and inferior class of beings subjugated by the dominant race, whether emancipated or not, have no privileges. What he's saying is nothing a free state can do can eliminate that status, that they're born inferior. And as a result, they will never be citizens regardless of what happens. So even freed slaves, right? Say this person runs away and is freed up north. They're not really free. Why? Because they're inferior. Did you read a case in Property Johnson versus McIntosh, the Indian case? Remember this one? Marshall uses almost identical language to discuss Indians. And I give the exact same spiel on property when I teach this case. The reason why Marshall did that was because he had to denigrate them. Because if Indians could make contracts, those contracts would have to be honored. But these were savages, inferior savages. You didn't have to honor their contracts. Whenever a reporter calls me about Roger Taney, I always say, what about John Marshall? People don't remember that one. But if you go back in your property textbooks and read Johnson, it's very similar. The mode of reason that they can never be parties to a contract because they're savages. In any event. The key move here, though, is we go back to Article 4, right? And I mentioned the Privileges or Immunities Clause up here. If a person actually was a citizen of a state, not only do they benefit from diversity, right? They benefit from this, and they get these rights. And arguably, one of these rights is the right to be free and not a slave. So Tani has to be very clear, saying they can never be citizens of the state, otherwise they get the privileges and immunities. That's why he has to literally separate them from this body of people to make sure they don't get these rights. He's insulating the Constitution from people of African descent. He's doing it very meticulously, step by step, right? So that was the first part of the holding, right? And he cites history, saying every person since the adoption of the Constitution knows that people of African descent can never be citizens. That's not true, right? I mean, Rachel mentioned before, what does Justice McLean say in his Dissenting ethics, and Curtis as well? I think he offers a fairly good response to this.
Well, I appreciate his response when he was talking about the treaty with Mexico, Louisiana, and Florida, that no one even questioned that when we acquired those territories, that those people would be citizens as well.
Good.
He also mentioned, like, that he can't fathom that Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, like, could say that the Constitution, or what does he say, took care not to convey in the Constitution that there could be property in man.
But numbers. I'm going to interrupt you for a second, right? And I'll go back to Kevin. So the dissent saying, how can the Constitution, the framers, James Madison, Hamilton, these other guys, right, think that there's no property in man? Go back to this clause, right? This migration, importation of persons, right? When you think of import, you think of like, a car, right? a laptop, right? An iPhone, right? A piece of property, chattel. It literally says the importation of persons, right? Usually when people travel, they're not imported. You import cargo, you don't import a person. So is Curtis wrong, right? Is there in the very text of the Constitution an explicit reference to importing people as if they're cargo?
I believe so, because, like, off the face of the Constitution, it says such person. However,
How do you import a person?
well, by trafficking.
Yeah.
There was, excuse me, they were saying that even some free states, they were trafficking persons to slave states, and that's how they did deal with business.
So Dave, let me ask you this question. You have the Constitution, which goes out of its way not to use the word slavery, it goes out of its way, right? But then you use words like import and intelligent labor and these sorts of words. Who's right, Tani or Curtis, right? I mean, they both make, I think, decent arguments based on text and history, one or the other, right? But how are we supposed to know who's actually right? Because you do have history that cuts, both directions.
I think it's kind of like the way that Tani looks at it. The courts always go off the precedent and historical background, I guess, gain their opinions. But I don't think it doesn't say like African descent per se. It says persons, and I think that's where Tani kind of is wrong.
So whoever gave me caramel has a bad idea. So one of the most famous abolitionists, his name was Lysander Spooner, very famous guy, Google him, really good guy. And he wrote that, by the way, Spooner, S-P-O-O-N-E-R, Lysander Spooner. And he wrote that the fact that it didn't say Africans, right? I think David pointed that a minute ago. The fact that it didn't use the word Africans, that persons, was so generic that maybe at some point in the future that understanding could change, right? Or what Tani argues in response is we have to look at this as it would have been understood in 1787. And any person reading this in 1787 knew exactly what that means. Yeah, Mark.
Do you think that Justice Tani was differentiating between blacks from Africa and blacks from the West Indies?
I don't think so. I think my reading is the race is inferior, period. I mean, there's actually biblical roots of sort of Ham, Noah. I mean, there was a long lineage of arguments of literally inferiority of the races. So I don't think it cared which province they came from. I don't think it mattered one bit. Yeah, Jason?
Does it seem a little bit though like a sloppy argument in that it doesn't seem fully based on the law?
Well, what is the law? The law give you an answer one with the other here?
No. But that's the point. It seems like he's going out of his way to create law rather than...
Yeah, okay, no, that part I agree with 100%. He's going out of his way. But the question I have with Rachel and with Kevin and David is something else. It's, what does the history actually say? Forget about Connie making stuff up. Is there actually an answer in history? Right? Go back to our question we led off with. Is this judgment correct or not? And Tani makes some arguments, McLean makes some arguments, dissent, Curtis makes some arguments in dissent. None of these cases are 100%, right? I mean, you can all be objective and say that this is not clear-cut issue. Now, Tani goes out of his way to say crazy stuff, okay? But he needs to do that, in his mind, to resolve once and for all the question of slavery. If he had done anything short of that, and somebody said, well, Scott's not a citizen because Missouri didn't give him citizenship, the next year there'll be another case with someone from Massachusetts or Pennsylvania who did get citizenship. And then what do you do, right? Then what do you do? So he tiptoed over this issue, actually more like pole vaulted over the issue, and said, I'm going to go further. Andre?
Do you think, like, in his own weird way, he thought he was preventing
Yes.
war?
Yes. He admitted this. This is not like Josh thinking this. He actually wrote this in letters and stuff. He honestly believed that this was going to be the way to avert war. Right?
That's what it seems to me reading it. Is that
He thought it would do less damage to allow slavery than to get rid of it. Right? Because to get rid of slavery he thought would be a lot of disruption. But just to keep it where it is he thought would be less disruptive. Now, he proved wrong, right? His judgment was wrong, and I think I used the word accelerated. It accelerated, I think, what was a conflict that was inevitable. But he honestly believed that he was going to broker this compromise. He looked, I show you the map, right? But he looked out west, and he said, wow, that's a lot of states you got there, right? It's a lot of states you got there. I mean, the lines we have now, those didn't exist. They were basically all territories, so they weren't states yet. But there's a lot of land out west that could be subjected to this regime. Okay.
Were any of the justices like involved with like economical like trafficking and slave work?
Were the justices slaveholders? I think Tani sold his slaves. I think he freed them. I vaguely recall he got rid of his slaves. I'm not positive. I don't know the others. I think McLean was he a northerner? Someone Google that. And McLean may have been a northerner. I can't recall if any of them actually got slaves.
I know Tani was from Maryland.
He was from Maryland. That was a very big slave state. In fact, Maryland was one of the border states, right? That was the Union, but was slave. But I have some vague recollection that Tani got rid of his slaves, but I don't know for sure. I'm sorry? McLean was from New Jersey, so I'm guessing he wasn't a slaveholder. But that was probably about it. Yeah, Jason?
I think the only thing that I would see that would counter what Tony's saying is the 3/5 compromise. Because everything else, you treat slaves as property, it mostly refers to them as property and persons of labor and things like that. But when you're counting people towards your representation, you would seem that you're calling them to some extent, 3/5 of a citizen, because it's a representative government.
That supports Tani's holding. And that would seem to support Tani's holding that, right? Or are you saying because more than zero, that means there's something?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see your point. So that because they're not zero, it's more than something, so it's some representation. Okay. That's your point. All right, but that's only the first part of the holding, right? That's only the first part of the holding. I mean, the case should have just stopped there. But it went on and on and on, as I'm sure you're well aware. Okay? The next part of the holding is funky, right? And I'm going to do this in a little bit of order. But Tani says, that's enough to dispose of this case, right? That he's not a citizen, therefore he doesn't have diversity jurisdiction, he can't bring suit in this court. But let's assume he was, right? Judges don't do this sort of thing, but let's assume he was a citizen. If the court had jurisdiction, which it doesn't, was the decision of Emerson to bring him to the free territory in what's now Minnesota, did that affect an emancipation, right? But to answer the question of whether bringing him to the territory affected emancipation, you have to answer another even bigger question. Did Congress have the power to even make a free territory? Did Congress have the power to say in the territory there's no slavery? Right? So Evan, what do we do there? What's Tani's ruling there?
Well, Tani says no.
Okay.
They have the power to do that.
Why not?
Basically because if they had the power to do that, it would deprive people. If the states could make, if the states could have free slaves, and they would bring free people, or slaves into the free states, those states could then deprive their owners or masters of their property.
Yeah. So there actually are two portions of this. Brittany, you want to add something?
Well, I was just gonna say, even with Tani and the Missouri Compromise, it was all they're trying to accomplish or save or salvage a political equipoise, and I looked that up, and it meant like to keep the interest the same. And so you didn't want, they were just trying to keep a balance, really, even with the slave states. If with the freedom coming in or whatever the case may be, and people moving into the north, slave holders moving to the north, and then kind of making those northern states turn into slave states. They were all trying to keep a balance, so there was a political balance in the Union.
But it's not just a balance, right? And I'll answer your question now, as we'll do it later, but if you could bring a person to Illinois and they become free, what does that do to the amount of slaves in the United States? The slave trade was banned. So every single time a slave was brought north, if that person could then become emancipated, what was the effect? Yeah, you reduce slaves. Now the flip side, what if a slave was brought south by a kidnapper, for example, right, from a northern state, and the southern state said, we're not going to allow the person to be free? It increases the stock, right? So this idea of the equipoise didn't embrace the kidnapping that was going on both north and the Underground Railroad going. So kidnapping going south, Underground Railroad going north, right? These were different competing forces, right? So what Tani was saying is, it doesn't even matter if they go to the free state of Illinois, because that's not enough to free the person. You have to go even beyond the federal territory. It's just beyond the equipoise as well. The Tani decision allowed the growth of slavery, but not its contraction.
I was just going to go back to the question that you asked about Congress having territorial.
That's where I want to go, yeah.
Because I feel that Tani's opinion was full of hypocrisy and ambiguity.
Yeah.
For one, it says, yes, it says that Congress does, no one can presume or contend that Congress can't make any law in a territory respecting the establishment of religion, free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or press, or the right of people of territory peaceably to assemble. So you're giving them, you're saying that Congress can't have the right to exercise territorial jurisdiction, but you're giving them right to exercise the jurisdiction and territory of what goes on in there.
Okay, yeah. So the most incoherent part of the opinion, I think I'll use even stronger language, the most insane part of the opinion is the territory clause part, right?
Yeah.
I want to, Evan, you mentioned due process, I'll come back to it later. I want to do the territory first, right? I think that's the sequence he does it in. So let's go back to our territory clause, right? And it says, the Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or the property belonging to the United States. Now, Adam, if you were just to read that, how, what would that mean to you? I mean, how would you understand that provision? If you just read that, that one sentence.
They can make laws or rules as necessary to.
Where? Where can they make these rules?
In federal government.
Well, where does it apply? Respecting what?
Newly acquired territory?
Yeah. When Congress acquires new territory, like the Louisiana Purchase, whatever else, they can make whatever needful rules are necessary. And the reason why is these territories are basically empty land. There was no government there. They each had a territorial governor who basically governed like a dictator. But they each had a governor, but they had no legislature. They had no infrastructure. You basically had to bribe people with land to go out there to occupy it, and it would only be considered for statehood when it reached a certain population. But that's how statehood works. If you get enough people to travel to a territory, you can claim territory and then make it a state. So I think Adam's right. If I just read that sentence, like, well, you have this new territory, and Congress can make whatever rules are necessary to govern it. Okay. Brandon, how does Tani read this provision? This is, I think, the most insane part of the entire case. I mean, just from a legal perspective, it's I think Jay is on point. It's a bizarre opinion. How does Tani read this?
He says Congress has no power over the person or property of a citizen, or what the citizens of the U.S. have granted.
I don't know what you just said. Sorry. Can you say it again, please?
I mean, I think he's saying that. Could you ask your question one more time?
How does Tani read the property clause?
I mean, they make rules and regulations.
How does Tani read it? What does Tani think with respect to slavery? How does this clause work? Amber?
He basically says that that when it was created in 1787, that was the only property to be considered.
Yeah.
Any property value.
Yeah, exactly. This is, in my mind, this is where the wheels come off, right? This is just, it's incoherent. He says that the Congress's power to make rules only affects the property held in 1787. Any newly acquired property after that year is not governed by this clause. Therefore, go back to our map, right? Congress doesn't have the power to make rules for any of these places, north or south of the Green Line. Amber, how does he get this? I'm looking at the text. Where on earth does he get this from?
He just says it says respecting the territory. It doesn't belong to the United States at the time, and nothing else was belonging to the
So he's saying, yeah, it only means the territory in 1787. Does that sound credible to you?
I mean, not really, because eventually all of it will belong to the United States.
Yeah, this clause was written with the understanding that there's a lot of land out west, right? They didn't quite know even how far it went. They knew there was stuff out west, and they have to acquire new land, new territory, new property. So Tani's basically saying, and I want to go back to my map here, right? Not only can't they make the lands known at this time slavery-free, all the way out to California the same, right? They won't be able to make any free territory all the way out to California. They might not even have known where the land ended at this point. No, at this point they did. But, in 1803 they didn't know. That's why Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to try and find the Pacific. That was one of their missions. But that's only the first part of the holding, right? What Tani says is Congress can't legislate a free territory anywhere because the property clause doesn't allow it. But that's not the end of the opinion, right? He keeps going beyond that, right? Because there was federal territory that was in the ownership of the United States in 1787, namely the District of Columbia. So, David, could Congress eradicate slavery in the District of Columbia, which was a federal enclave? Under the Territory Clause, was there any problem with eliminating slavery there under the Territory Clause?
Under the Territorial Clause,
No, because it was land that was in ownership back in the 1780s, right? So what's Tani's next step to take care of the District of Columbia?
the due process.
Okay, so what does the Due Process Clause say?
That the federal government can't deprive anybody of life, liberty, or property without due process.
Exactly. Everyone heard him? The Fifth Amendment, Due Process Clause, says that the federal government cannot deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, David, how would eliminating slavery run afoul of that provision?
If they eliminate slavery, they remove property from the slave owners.
There it is, yeah, exactly. Exactly, thank you. So what Tani basically has to argue is this. The Fifth Amendment the Fifth Amendment protects property interests. You already said in Part 1 of the opinion, slaves are property. Oh, that makes a little more sense now, doesn't it, right? He was building up to that. This entire bit about slaves being property, he was putting in his pocket, so to speak, for the later part about the Due Process Clause. But he said, look, we already held that slaves are property. And for the federal government to deprive someone of that right, that is, if someone brings their slave into this federal territory, and as a result of that they lose their ownership, that's a deprivation of property. But it's not just property, it's also liberty. And there's a strange irony that you're laughing. Why are you laughing?
Well, it's the
Finish my sentence,
too, right? It's like you're depriving these people of liberty. at
Yeah,
their expense.
so, yeah, good. That, you still might argue, yeah, Emily?
But that's why he made the argument.
Yes,
that
okay,
slave
now you're
owners-
getting it. Very good. So everyone see what's going on here, right? The Fifth Amendment says no person shall be denied of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Hello? You're a slave. You're being denied your liberty, right? But they're not people. You get now why he did what he did. In the very same opinion where he said the slave owners have this liberty interest in holding a slave, he also said the slaves themselves can't be free because if they were, you'd have the competing interest and they couldn't be held as slaves. Right? This was the pro-slavery literature, right? Saying that, look, slaves cannot benefit from the Fifth Amendment because they were, they're being held as chattel, right? As a chattel. So this is why, again, I think he had to go out of his way to say these people are inferior. It's a subclass, right? They're not governed by the Privileges or Immunities Clause. And they're not governed by the Fifth Amendment, because if they were, slavery would be unconstitutional. Right? Abolition said, look, we have the Fifth Amendment and privileges and immunities. It says persons, slavery is unconstitutional. Tani says, no, 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 you're not people. You don't get your privileges, you don't get your due process. Now, Amber, yes?
I was just gonna say, but then, I mean, in the dissents, they say, like, specifically in the Constitution, under the slave trade clause, that they call them people.
They are. It says persons, yeah.
Yeah, so
It
like,
says persons, it says people.
then he just goes, no, you're not a person.
Which is why, again, he has to go out of his way to define them at such a degraded level, at basically like subhuman. Because even though it uses the word person and people, he says they're not actually people in the Fifth Amendment. Right? The beginning of the opinion makes a lot more sense when you get to the end. Right? The reason why he uses such awful language is for this reason, to get them out of the Fifth Amendment. Right? Everyone with me so far? So this is often described as the beginning of what would be called substantive due process. All right, the phrase is, substantive due process. Substantive due process. The notion that the due process clause is not merely about procedures, right? Saying that you get a trial or something. That there's a substance or a meaning to the word liberty. That this word liberty has significance. And in the 20th century, this would be used to say that there's rights to contraception and abortion and sodomy and you name it, right? But one of the first times the Supreme Court ever actually said a federal law violates someone's liberty interests was Dred Scott. Now, Tani did not invent this. People say, oh, Tani invented substantive due process. No, 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 no. Pro-segregation literature for decades had made this argument. There was a report by the House of Representatives, there was a committee on this, which said the Missouri Compromise violates the Fifth Amendment's due process clause. So Tani didn't invent this at all. I mean, he did invent it, but people often criticize it. Why? They say, well, here it is. When you read, we'll do a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey in some time. It's an abortion case from Pennsylvania. And Justice Scalia draws an analogy between Dred Scott and the abortion cases. Well, people say, oh my God, Scalia is saying that abortion and slavery are the same. No, 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 no. That's what they say at confirmation hearings, right? Scalia's actual point is that the idea of substantive due process stems from here. And the same reason why Dred Scott was wrong, there is no substantive due process, the abortion cases are wrong. But people often miss the linkage between those two cases. All right, so let's try and recap where we are so far. So first off, people of African descent are not citizens. They can never be. They're subhuman. They're not even persons, not people. Okay. Second, the Territorial Clause only governs property in existence in 1787. Therefore, you can't have any free territories north or south of the Green Line. Right? And then third, even in territories where the federal government can have ownership, like the District of Columbia, the Fifth Amendment prevents the emancipation of slaves precisely because it violates the due process clause. So as a result, the court invalidates the Missouri Compromise, right? Which wasn't even at issue, wasn't even briefed. The government didn't even file a brief in this case, right? The U.S. government didn't even file a brief in the case, but they went out of their way to strike down the Missouri Compromise, this congressional deal that had been in effect for 40 years. And they went one step further, right? Boone, what was the coup de grace? What about the fact that Dred Scott traveled to Illinois, and under Illinois law, he should have been free? What does the court say about that?
That it's like free, right? What do you mean? Like the state?
Did the court say that, did Justice Tani say that he became free by virtue of his travel to Illinois, which is a free state? We're not talking about the Fifth Amendment due process, we're talking about the state of Illinois.
No, he did not.
Why? What does the court say about the state law issue here? What did the Missouri Supreme Court found about this?
They said no, that he's not free either.
And does Tani agree with that? Yeah, he does. What Tani basically says is, and the final question about whether Scott was freed when he went to Illinois, yeah, we agree with the Missouri Supreme Court, even though they reversed their own precedent on that exact question some years earlier. So the bottom line, Scott's not a citizen, the court has no jurisdiction, and the judgment must be reversed. So that's the judgment, right? The judgment was no jurisdiction. So, I'm gonna ask the question again. Let's see what happens, I don't know. Maybe it'll be 50-50 again. The judgment in Dred Scott was correct, 857. Go vote again, please. See what it's about. I never know how these things shake out. Vote again. Sounds like the numbers change at all. I think it was 18 to 16 before the other way. The judgment in Dred Scott was correct in 1857. Another 10 to 15 seconds. Wait till it's 34, because that was the number of people. There better be, if you voted before, vote again. Don't screw this up. Because I think there were 34 before.
She may not have voted.
Oh, fine.
So
okay.
that might be one of them.
Fine. Okay, I'm gonna stop it here. All right, let's see what we got. Whoa, okay, let's see. Ooh, well, a couple of you changed your mind, I think. So what's 17 to 15? No, the first one was 16 to 18. True overtook false. Wow, so I guess at least a couple of you changed your mind and said this was correct. After discussion. What'd you put, true or false?
The first time or no?
Now.
I didn't get a chance to before I had a call.
Now I want you to cast a
No.
vote. Because what's your vote, true or false?
False.
Did your answer say the same?
Yep.
Okay, then it's just about 50-50, almost exactly the same. You know, I don't particularly care which way you vote, but I hope you appreciate that this case is so self-evidently wrong today, only because we're 100 and some odd years behind it, but it's not necessarily self-evidently wrong at the time. So let me walk through the dissents a little bit. We mentioned before. So we have Justice McLean. And McLean is basically saying that this is, you know, insane. That slavery can only exist by positive law, right? That's not a natural institution. And that if Congress or the state of Illinois wants to eradicate it, they have the full power to do this, whether it's in a territory or otherwise. Okay? He also says the Missouri Supreme Court more or less overturned its own decision solely to basically bolster the institution of slavery. Justice Curtis, I think, has a little bit more of a historical dissent. And he explains that even at the time of the ratification, free-born inhabitants of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, North Carolina were citizens. And nothing in the Constitution worked to change that. In fact, in some states, people of African descent could even vote at the time of the framing. So Tani's history, I think, is wrong, or at least not wrong, incomplete. Curtis also rejects the notion that the Constitution is for the white race, which is one of Tani's arguments, because about half the states did have franchise for people of African descent. At bottom, he said there's no reason to reach these different questions. He also mentions the fact that the children were born above the line, right? And if slavery is merely a positive institution, how could a person born in a free state be born into slavery? Okay, the majority doesn't really mention the significance of the child being born north of the line. Okay. Okay. Questions on the dissents?
I have a question.
Yeah, Rachel.
So the Scots were allowed to marry,
But, and I mentioned this, marriage in the loosest sense was a transaction. Basically, one guy selling the woman to the other to create more children slaves. Right? That was, the effect of handing over a female was to allow that person to reproduce and make more slave children.
Right.
Right,
But
so it was a transaction.
It was still done by justice of the peace is what I read.
Yeah, I mean, in the loosest sense of the word, yeah.
So that's not the government exerting jurisdiction over
Oh, I see what
citizens?
you're saying. The fact that the government allowed them to be married means they do have some rights.
Yeah.
So this is, I think, Jason's argument as well. If they count for 3/5, it's better than 0, right? That's kind of your argument. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence that the people, slaves, even though they were held in captivity, they still had certain rights, because you could emancipate a slave. There was paperwork that went along with it. It was not like a cow, right? It wasn't strictly a piece of like an animal. There were certain things that happened otherwise, and Tani denies every aspect of that.
Right. And it was I read, because I was interested in it, and it said it was a formal ceremony, and it was a justice of the peace of, like, that territory at that time.
Yeah.
So.
That actually may have been necessary to finalize the transaction. Like, that may have been a condition that money was paid on the condition that the person actually got married.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Look it up, maybe you can tell me later. But it wasn't just like, hey, Dr. Emerson, I really like this woman Harry, I can go marry her. It wasn't like that.
Yeah.
Andrew?
Do you think that Tani eventually regretted writing this opinion?
Well, it's a good question, and I think the answer is probably not. Probably not. I don't think so. There's just one great passage from Justice Scalia's dissent in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I want you to read it to you. There's a okay, so I'm going to read you this passage from Scalia's dissent. It says, "There comes vividly to the mind a portrait that hangs in the Harvard Law School. Roger Brooke Tani painted in 1859. The 82nd year of his life, and the second after Dred Scott." So this was towards the end of his life, 2 years after Dred Scott. "He is in all black, sitting in a shadowed red armchair, left hand resting upon a pad of paper in his lap, right hand hanging limply, almost lifelessly, beside the inner arm of the chair. He sits facing the viewer and staring straight out. There seems to be on his face and in his deep-set eyes an expression of profound sadness and disillusionment. Perhaps he always looked that way, even when dwelling upon the happiest of thoughts. But those of us who know the luster of his great Chief Justiceship came to be eclipsed by Dred Scott cannot help believing that he had that case, its already apparent consequences for the court, and its soon-to-be played-out consequences for the nation, burning on his mind. I expect that 2 years earlier he too had thought himself calling the contending sides of national controversy to their end by accepting a common mandate rooting in the Constitution." So to Scalia, maybe he did realize that this was a screw-up, maybe not in 1859. Because what happened in 1860, right? What happened in 1860? Someone know it? Well, what preceded that? Yeah. So in 1860, right? In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Okay? He was the first Republican ever elected president. And he ran on the platform of abolition, right? The platform of the Republican Party was abolition. That year, there were 4 major candidates in the ballot. And Lincoln won a majority of the electoral votes without a single Southern voter. And in some Southern states, what's going on? You all right? Good. In some Southern states, Lincoln wasn't even put on the ballot, which is remarkable. But he won anyway. And shortly after Lincoln won the election, the Civil War began in earnest. And one of the first instances was the firing of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. It was actually a federal military base, and the people of South Carolina fired on it. And it fell pretty quickly. And in fairly rapid succession, one state after the other started to secede. Lincoln was inaugurated in 1861, And who gave him the oath of office? Tani, as the Chief Justice. That must have been awkward, right? I think that was very awkward. And the reason why I think it was especially awkward was because for years Lincoln had ran for office on the platform of saying that Dred Scott was wrong. So you may have heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? That wasn't actually for the presidency. Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas for the Senate in 1858, the Illinois senatorial race. And one of the issues in that senatorial races was Dred Scott correct? So Stephen Douglas took the traditional view. He said, well, you know what? I don't agree with it, but 5 justices, 6 justices, 7 justices said it. That must make it right. Lincoln didn't. Lincoln took a different position. Now, I'll be very careful here. He did not say that Dred Scott should be just disregarded. He never said that. Right? People say, oh, Lincoln said ignore the Supreme Court. That's not what Lincoln said. His argument was actually much more sophisticated. He said, okay, who was involved in the case? Dred Scott and Sandford, right? 2 people. Was the U.S. government a party to that case? No. Did the government file a brief? No. You guys know this. You took CIFRO. Can a party who's not served be subject to litigation? No, right? The first thing you do the CIFRO, right? The first week, you gotta get service, right? You get to serve the process. How can the Supreme Court bind a party who wasn't even subject to the case? Lincoln says he can't. Therefore, we should treat Dred Scott as a decision between Dred Scott and Sandford, and that's it, and we can move on with our lives. In other words, there was no way for the court to invalidate the Missouri Compromise, Lincoln said, because the government wasn't even party to the case. So let's just keep on doing what we're doing. Amber.
Well, didn't the free states ignore it anyways? They just completely disregarded the decision. So.
Well, what do you mean they ignored it? What were they required? Did Tani say the states had to do anything?
Well, no, that's what it says. Like they just. Nothing.
But Tani didn't tell the states they had to do something. He did tell Congress though. Tani told Congress you can't allow freedom in the territories. And what Lincoln said was, that's nice, but the territories and the U.S. government wasn't party to the case, so we don't have to follow it. Everyone see that, right? Everyone understand what I just said? It's a very narrow point that most people simply miss. So Lincoln was saying, look, let's just limit this case to its parties, and we don't need to follow it. He said it was the moral decision, it was wrong, and he made his entire, I think, political career on the back of getting rid of Dred Scott. So you can imagine when he was being sworn in by Lincoln in 1861, that was a little bit of an awkward conversation because he basically came to power attacking Tani's, most significant decision in his career. Now I want to pause here for a minute, right? This is Paul, right? How many people do you think Lincoln's, this is question 3, just true or false? Lincoln's reading of Dred Scott was correct, that we should just limit a case to its holding, and parties who are not subject to it, aren't bound by it. So if the Congress wants to ignore it and keep having free slaves, free territory, they can do it. And if, Illinois wants to keep liberating their slaves, they can do it. So just vote, true or false?
True or false that Lincoln's reading was...
Yeah, it's correct. Lincoln was correct. True or false? Sorry, I'll make this clear. Lincoln was correct. True. False. Got it?
On purpose.
Oh, I didn't. it was no, that actually was totally inadvertent. Lincoln was correct, true or false? Which I want you to get you guys on this one. It was actually completely inadvertent. They put the caps. I was holding on the shift key. So we got. Let's start there. Okay, so that's what we got. Okay, so. Oh, wow, more than I thought. So about 60% say it was correct, and about 40% say it was wrong. Where am I up to? I think, yeah, Jason. What'd you put?
I put it was true.
Okay.
Why is it true? Because the court is overreaching if they don't have jurisdiction.
Oh, jurisdiction. Very good. Yeah, I think your next, what'd you put here?
I put true.
Okay. Why'd you put true? Alright, anyone gets false, but wanna raise your hand? Okay, Andre.
I think that it sets like a weird precedent where it gives Congress too much power
To disregard judgments?
to just disregard judgments when they feel that.
But did the judgments bind them though?
Yeah, I believe it was found.
So when the Supreme Court speaks, it speaks for the world, or I guess the United States.
The United States.
Amber?
I mean, it's like, they weren't a party in the case, you can't find somebody that's not a party in the case. I just don't understand how you can say that.
Give me another false. Who else put false? Yeah, Mark.
I just thought that the spirit of the decision was for a broader audience than just the two parties involved.
So you think that people can disregard the decision? You think Lincoln was wrong?
I think Lincoln was wrong.
You think Lincoln was wrong? That everyone should be bound by the case?
At that time, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Chelsea. Was Lincoln right?
I put true, but I went back and forth because it, like you said, it's just between the two parties. But then they could have just brought the Missouri Compromise in their own suit and ruled the same way.
Alright.
So technically, eventually,
Alright.
it would be the precedent.
Alright. Anyone else want to say that Lincoln was wrong? Who thinks that Lincoln was wrong? Yeah, Elizabeth.
Like, precedent applies to other parties, whether they're in the case or not. So I just don't.
Does it? Oh, so precedent applies, so the judgment applies.
So like, why do they have to be a party? Like, do I have to be a party in every suit?
Oh, what a good question, what a good comment. So, I'm gonna build off Elizabeth, so I think she framed it well. So you'll read in class after the midterm next week, or the week after, I can't recall, Brown, right? Brown versus Board of Education, big case, you'll know the nature, right? The case itself presented the question of whether the segregation laws of 4 states, you had Kansas, Virginia, South Carolina, and, I'm blanking on the 4th, but basically there were 4 states, okay? And the Supreme Court held that, yes, these segregation laws in public schools were unconstitutional. Arkansas was not a party to that case. And we read Cooper v. Aaron, right? We talked about this. We talked about it? I can't remember where we are. Anyway, we'll talk about it after a few weeks. So Arkansas was not a party to the case. So the governor of Arkansas said, wait a minute, Lincoln was right. Brown, that only affected Kansas and South Carolina and Virginia. Arkansas, we weren't a party to the case, so we're going to keep our schools separate for now. We'll keep our schools segregated. So eventually the Supreme Court got to them, eventually, after federal troops entered the school in Little Rock. We talked about this, I know we did. Yeah, we talked about it, I know we did. Remember the Little Rock troops? Yeah, we talked about it. But the fact is, if you think Lincoln was correct, which is about 60% of you, then you also think, I suppose, that Brown did not have the same effects. And that a state that was not party could just disregard it because they disagreed with it. It's an uncomfortable truth. It really is. I want to ask the question again because I think I'd see different numbers. But Lincoln's argument is at once powerful and dangerous. Because if we simply say that we only follow a judgment if we're party A, party B, plaintiff, defendant, right? Then the Supreme Court never has any sort of binding effect on anyone. But Elizabeth used a different word. She said precedent, right? So you may say, well, we're not going to follow it because we're bound, but it's a precedent. Legal writing, right? You have your persuasive precedent, you have your binding precedent, but still precedent. So do we just treat the Supreme Court decision as if it was, a Mississippi case that, it's persuasive, that's nice, we'll do something else now? The entire notion of precedent is premised in people following it because it sounds good, right? Now, if a judge comes along in Little Rock and says, you now desegregate, I'm going to extend Brown to you, you're bound by this now. Okay, then you have a judgment against you. And if you don't do that, you can be held in contempt of court. And what the judge says, I'm going to arrest you, and you say, come and get me, come and take me. And you have the police guard around you. So, before you jump on the Abe Lincoln bandwagon, which you're welcome to jump on, play out the consequences, right? And what that actually means to say we're going to limit the decision of the court to plaintiff and defendant. Brittany?
Is that kind of going back
back to what you said a couple weeks ago about other judges from other countries coming over here and being impressed that
Yeah.
we all follow their binding precedent?
Yeah, I mean, Lincoln was saying we don't have to. He said it's not binding on us. And I'm sure most people are saying, of course, Dred Scott's an awful position, but Brown's awesome, right? Well, that's not a distinction, right? I mean, well, maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Brown is such an important case that we can have a different rule for it, but an evil case like Dred Scott we can't. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, what do you think?
I was kind of going to bring up the morality.
Morality,
aspect of, like, what about public opinion and?
Well, what does Tani say about public opinion in this case? He has a discussion of public opinion, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He does, doesn't he? What does he say about public opinion? Do you remember?
I guess that doesn't matter.
Oh, what he says is public opinion at that time was very pro-slavery.
Oh, okay. Well, then
Yeah.
it matters.
Yeah, I saw a hand somewhere here. But I don't want to skip over your point. Your point's a good one. But what your argument basically is Dred Scott bad, Brown good. So that justifies the distinction.
Well, hindsight is 20/20.
Hindsight's always 20/20. I saw a hand somewhere over there. Yeah, Brandon.
Lincoln's view is what inevitably led to war, right? Or would you say that?
I think Tani did a little more than Lincoln did for war.
You think what?
I think Tani did far more than Lincoln did to bring the war about. So I'm not sure if Lincoln's view led to the war.
But I mean, for Lincoln, it was a hill on which to die.
Well, I mean, he was assassinated, but I'm not sure what you mean.
I mean, like it was worth 600,000 American lives.
Well, I don't know when he ran for office and he started making these arguments, he knew this was going to happen. Right? I mean, he was basically in obscurity. He was an obscure lawyer, didn't have much of a national platform, and he started making these arguments, and he built a fairly large following. Eventually, yes, 600,000, the bloodiest war in American history for sure. Yes, ma'am.
I just think that that's what made Tani so dangerous, because how clever he was to get his points across, and how he, like the same thing when we went back to the time, the commerce, to giving people certain freedom so that we could get this thing moving.
Oh, so you're saying when a judge starts reinventing the Constitution,
Yeah, because you find something to link it to.
Yeah.
And then that way, people that have this opinion that may be immoral, but now it's linked to law. Let's follow the law. What does the law say?
Yeah, it's not me, it's a constitution, right?
What
it's
is
a
it? Let's
constitution.
follow, and that's American.
Exactly.
And then you get this justification to be able to argue things that may be immoral. And a lot of people may stand behind that. So that's what made Tani so dangerous. It was very smart, but it was very dangerous. But he locked it in such a way.
Yeah, Jason, and then Andre.
I don't necessarily agree with how he got there, but I guess my question would be, maybe he was right from the standpoint there is ambiguity in the Constitution, and he said it. If Congress wants to change the law, change the law. And this might have been a good thing in some ways, because in some ways it led to the 13th and 14th Amendment, which clarified, this is the law of the land.
Well, I think the more than Clark, I think it changed.
Yeah.
Andre.
It's hard to separate the issues because they're so linked together between like the morality of the slave issue and what's going on, but like looking at the Constitution as like an instruction manual of how you do things. I mean, there are ways. It's like a rule book. So just follow the rules and stop. Like you can't invent new rules. Tani said, if you see injustice, make an amendment, and that's why we have the amendment. Now, whether or not you can pass an amendment is a different issue entirely. But as like far as the people have always used laws to kind of change, like support their own morality. They do it with the Bible all the time, right? So it's not a new idea, so to speak. It's just that's how I feel.
Well, piggybacking
piggybacking
off of what Jason and Andre said, I mean, it's very similar to like what Justice Harlan said in Hans v. Louisiana. That, Chisholm was probably decided the right way. But now that we have the 11th Amendment, we can
what a good segue. All right, let's talk about the amendments, and a couple of you mentioned this. So, unlike most Supreme Court decisions, Dred Scott was never overruled, right? There's no decision in the U.S. report saying Dred Scott's been overturned. There's no such case. Instead, after a bloody civil war, the death of 600,000 people, the Congress ratified in fairly short order what I call the second founding. We often think of the founders like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, but there was a second founding in 1868, and people like John Bingham of Ohio and Jacob Howard of Michigan, you never heard of these people, but they were instrumental in drafting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So at the time, the southern states were basically destroyed, and they had no representation in Congress. So the people ratifying these amendments in Congress were basically all Northerners, and they were all Republicans. The radical Republicans, they were called. And for many of the southern states, their admission back to the Union was on the promise to ratify these amendments. Not all of them did. In fact, I think, oh God, what was it? Either Mississippi or Louisiana ratified the 13th Amendment in the last couple of years. It was actually fairly recent. They didn't need it because it took effect a century ago, but it was fairly recent. So the 13th Amendment nullifies Dred Scott in a fairly swift manner. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. By the chain gangs, right? That's, oh brother, where art thou, right? That's the punishment part. There was actually a fear that this would make jails illegal, that if you couldn't keep people in jail, they would get slaves. They actually put that in. So neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Again, this provision doesn't just affect government. This was the first part of the Constitution that binds private actors. That notwithstanding the Fifth Amendment's due process clause, and notwithstanding Tani's insane reading of the Territorial clause, we are saying slavery can't exist anywhere. Any place in the United States. Think of the geography, right? Go back to our map. North and south, that green line doesn't matter. Can't exist anywhere, period, end of sentence. That nullifies the whole thing of Dred Scott. In a single, I mean, I want you to appreciate, this is not just like, oh yeah, no slavery, it can't exist anywhere. Not in the northern states, southern states. Remember Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, okay, we're going to emancipate slaves in the rebel territory, right? He didn't touch a slave in the north. This did. This emancipated immediately all the slaves in the United States anywhere in the jurisdiction. Right? Everyone with me so far, right? And then a couple years later, ratified the 14th Amendment. And each provision of this is directly responsive to an element of Tani's holding. So the first one is what's called the Citizenship Clause. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. Tani's opinion held that people of African descent could never be citizens of the United States or any states, even if emancipated. Right? The Citizenship Clause provides that all persons, regardless of race, merely by virtue of birth, would be citizens of both. Right? Both. U.S. and the state they reside. That is nullifying Tani's diversity jurisdiction holding. I want you to think of how closely the text of the Constitution maps Tani's opinion. The same way that Tani tried to graft his opinion on the Constitution clause by clause, this is unwinding that, clause by clause. Okay? Second, the next clause, right? This is called the Privileges or Immunities Clause. Do not confuse this with the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4. This is the 14th Amendment Privileges or Immunities Clause. It says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. In Dred Scott, Tani concluded that because African Americans could never be citizens, they never got these rights, these privileges and immunities. But by virtue of the Citizenship Clause, however, the freedmen were now citizens, and they cannot be denied these liberties. Okay? But here's the kicker. Remember Tani said that these privileges or immunities are only for U.S. citizenship? It says right here, the states could not deny these privileges. So if there was any doubt about the rights of the freedmen, it wasn't just federal protection. It was also state protection. Okay? The states could no longer deny people of these rights and liberties. Everyone understand, right? It's not just you get federal protection. The states could not deny you of these rights. And that was a revolutionary change. Because to this point, the Constitution provided no guarantee for states. Right? Barron v. Baltimore, the First Amendment, did not apply to the states. If a state wanted to take your property, they could. But now, the states cannot deprive people of these privileges and immunities. Now, what are the privileges and immunities? You'll read a case, it's after the midterm next week, but there was a decision from 1873 called the Slaughterhouse Cases, where the court basically said these privileges or immunities are very narrow rights, which basically don't matter. So this provision, more or less, the Slaughterhouse case in 1873 more or less deleted this clause from the Constitution. They took like a red pen and crossed it out. Okay. Third, let's keep going down the line. It says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay. The Fifth Amendment's due process clause only concerns the federal government. But now, the 14th Amendment's due process clause binds the states. And the states cannot deprive someone of due process of law. And we just said that all people, regardless of race, are citizens. And therefore they're protected by this clause, that their liberty counts as well. And there's a certain irony then, that Tani used the word liberty in the sense of talking about slave ownership, but that's now wiped out. And this opens the door to the next question. What is liberty in the 14th Amendment? Now, it's a pretty big debate that the word liberty in the Fifth Amendment, what it means. But here, there is a lot of evidence that the word liberty, the substance of the word liberty here meant the first 8 amendments of the Bill of Rights, right? That the liberty interests the states cannot violate were the 8 amendments of the Bill of Rights. This would become later known as the doctrine of incorporation. The notion that the Bill of Rights now applies to the states, that the states can't violate the freedom of the press, they can't violate freedom of exercise, they can't establish, it's a tricky example, but they might be able to establish a religion. Okay? The key point here is what is liberty, right? What is liberty? And there's a lot of evidence that the framers understood that to include certain rights. Well, that rights are not written down. Unenumerated rights, are those included as well? We'll do cases like involving abortion and birth control and contraception and sodomy and everything else, right? Okay. Okay. We go down even more, right? We get this new clause, the final one. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This is a new concept altogether. There is no equal protection clause in the Fifth Amendment, right? Now states are prohibited from denying all persons, not just citizens, all persons, the equal protection of the laws. Now again, the Fifth Amendment does not have an equal protection clause. And the Supreme Court would later grapple with this in a decision called Bowling v. Sharpe, S-H-A-R-P-E, 1955, I think. And the question there was about whether the District of Columbia was forced to desegregate their schools. That is, did the Equal Protection Clause bind the federal government? Okay? But what I want you to appreciate about these provisions is that they were drafted by fairly smart lawyers. And these lawyers were very much aware of Dred Scott. They were on Lincoln's team. And they recognized that they needed to put in the Constitution a way to overturn that decision, right? They didn't want to wait to bring another test case and hope that 5 justices ruled in their favor. That was not what they wanted to do. They wanted to bypass the Supreme Court altogether and codify, hardwire in the Constitution, a decision nullifying Dred Scott. And with remarkable certainty and precision, they did exactly that. What you'll probably read over the next few weeks is how has the 13th and 14th Amendments been interpreted, right? Has it been interpreted consistent with how the drafters understood these terms, perhaps what they intended? In some respects, has it gone beyond their intent? In other respects, has entire clauses been ignored? That will be the next few weeks of study. But the Dred Scott decision is probably one of the most important ever because of how it occasioned this second forming of our Constitution. Questions? Mark?
I saw a lot of irony in Tani's references back to the writers of the Declaration and of the Constitution, especially since the writer of the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson, who had 6 children with a black woman named Sally Hemings. And Jefferson was in France at the time that the Constitution was wrote, so it was written primarily by James Madison. One of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' children was James Madison Hemings. And James Madison Hemings had a child who was the first elected senator from one of the western states.
I didn't know that.
By one of his grandchildren, so last name Roberts. So for Tani to be so presumptuous with regards to what the writers of those 2 documents may have been, I mean, ends right then and there with the fact that Thomas Jefferson, was
Jefferson was a conflicted person.
Yeah.
There are more books written about him than I can even count. There's a professor at Harvard, her name is Annette Gordon. Oh God, I'm drawing a blank on her name. Annette Reed Gordon, I might be inverting her names. But she wrote a pretty good book on the Hemings story, and if you want to read more. These were conflicted people. They openly wrote about how slavery was evil, yet they weren't able to extricate themselves from it. In fact, one of the most popular movements at the time was the notion that the way to eradicate slavery was to send the slaves back to Africa. And it was called the Manumission Society, I think that's what it was called. James Madison was a prominent member. And the idea was, we can't stop this here, but let's just pay to send them back to Africa and have their own country. And in fact, the country of Liberia, right, was basically founded precisely for that. If you look at the Liberian flag, it's basically the US flag. It's very similar. In fact, people often use the wrong emoji. They use the Liberian flag instead of the American flag. Trust me on this, they do, because it looks very similar. It's little. And in fact, the capital of Liberia is called Monrovia, after James Monroe. And they actually adopted our Constitution in toto. Their Constitution is a verbatim copy of ours. That was part of this manumission, back to Africa plan. Yeah.
And further irony is perhaps that Sally Hemings lived in Charlottesville with her children, and with all of the disruption that occurred in Charlottesville recently, it's just interesting that all of these things came kind of full circle.
Jason?
Ignoring parts of Tani's argument, isn't this exactly how our Constitution is supposed to work? That you reach a situation that we haven't planned for, we don't know what to do exactly. So instead of the court creating new law, which they kind of did, we go back and we look to Congress to kind of fix this situation and help us, create the policy that really needs to exist.
I'll answer your question a little bit differently. Generally, when the Supreme Court issues an opinion, we take it, all right, well, shucks, that's it. Obamacare is constitutional. Gay marriage is constitutional. We'll just move on. Abortion is constitutional. That wasn't always the mentality. We saw Chisholm v. Georgia, right? The court issued a decision, 11th Amendment, and like 2 years later, they ratify an amendment basically nullifying it. In the 1890s, might be off the year, the Supreme Court struck down an income tax that was enacted by statute. And the people then ratified an amendment to allow for an income tax. All too often we have this sense that the Supreme Court is right and we'll just go along with it. But the people have the power to change the Constitution beyond appointing another justice. Some years ago, a number of senators proposed an amendment to overturn the Citizens United decision, right? The campaign finance case, very controversial. And I always thought it was a foolish approach because had one of their justices been appointed by a Democratic candidate, it would have been overturned, right? So what's easier? Nominating one justice, having him or her confirmed by the Senate, or getting 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states. Duh, right? A lot easier to just appoint Merrick Garland instead of Neil Gorsuch. But that's the exact wrong answer, right? If there's a decision by the court that's wrong, it should be, I think, the people who reverse it, not just a single vote of the Supreme Court. Good question, Jason. What else? Yeah, Amber.
Well, I just think it's really interesting talking about, you know, timeline, how things go, and bringing up, you know, how courts eventually will get to a new decision. But there was something that someone had brought up to me a while ago, that people have short-term memory in terms of thinking in the future. They only think short-term. They don't think long-term. And so you see how, like, history goes by where slaves they become free, but no one ever thought to give them rights. And then once they get rights.
Oh, I disagree.
But no, I'm saying, like, it wasn't brought
What's
up.
that right there? That's that privileges and immunities.
No,
They
I'm
absolutely
saying
did think to give
it was,
rights.
like you said, it was limited. So they
And
didn't
that's
get
why you'll
full
read the
rights.
slaughterhouse case next week for class.
Yeah.
There was the phrase privilege and immunity, that was like a big deal. That was like the crown jewel of the 14th Amendment. That was the biggie, right? To give them the same rights that the white people had. That's precisely the provision meant to do it. But your sentiment's right. In the end, they didn't get them. Why? And the Supreme Court plays a very big role in that. What else? So, yeah, Emily.
Well, the book mentioned right after the 14th Amendment how the second section was really frustrating to women who were a part of the.
Oh yeah, I didn't even mention that. Yeah, why was it frustrating to women?
Neither really did Tani. That's what I picked up on until like the end of his opinion when he said, "Oh, undoubtedly, women and children are citizens," but he also qualified citizens to be members of the political community. But women and
So
children.
you'll read a case about a woman's right to join the Supreme Court bar after the midterm. So we'll get back to that. Brittany?
I was saying that wasn't like they didn't just do it on accident, because that was the first time they said that gender was specifically mentioned.
Yeah.
So it was purpose.
The word men, right?
Right.
The phrase was if men were disenfranchised. Let me you're all packing up. Stop packing up, please. You have 3 minutes left. So let me summarize it and I'll let you out of here. The reason why this case is important is not because we think the case is morally correct or even the judgment was correct, but it illustrates with painful clarity what happens if the Supreme Court issues a decision and people don't go along with it. Whether by Lincoln's, we're gonna narrow it down, by the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically ignores Dred Scott, doesn't it? It basically does. But it actually took an amendment process, a violent war, and an amendment process to get rid of this decision, which radically changed our Supreme Court and Constitution in the second half. And this is why I'd like to end at this point in the semester. We're done with structure, we move on to rights. Midterm on Tuesday. Any questions? See you all later.